all we want. We just want to know. We just want to know what happened.
An 18-year-old star football player found dead after vanishing during a 4th of July boating trip with friends, as questions swirl about what led up to the teenager's tragic death. What do authorities know about the disappearance and death of college wide receiver Nolan Wells? Here's what you need to know.
On the 4th of July, Horn Island becomes a sanctuary of noise. Located roughly 10 miles off the Mississippi Gulf Coast, this long, narrow strip of sand draws hundreds of boaters looking to celebrate the holiday away from the mainland. It is a place defined by crowds, music, and the shifting sun. But on July 4th, it also became the setting for a disappearance that defies easy explanation. Nolan Wells was 18 years old. As a college wide receiver, he was in peak physical condition, a young man whose life was built around discipline, athletic performance, and a clear vision for his future. When he stepped onto a private boat with 3 friends from high school to head out to Horn Island that morning, there was no indication that the trip would be anything other than ordinary. Yet by midnight, the celebration had evaporated. Nolan's mother called local authorities to report her son missing. 2 days later, a U.S. Park Service ranger made a grim discovery on the northwestern tip of the island, a body, later identified through dental records as Nolan Wells. What makes this case significant from an investigative standpoint is not just the tragic outcome, but the location itself. Horn Island is an undeveloped barrier island. It has no running water, no electricity, no shelter. It is a wilderness surrounded by the unpredictable currents of the Gulf of Mexico. For an 18-year-old athlete to vanish from a heavily populated holiday beach without a single person noticing a struggle or hearing a cry for help forces us to look closely at the immediate explanation offered in the early hours of the investigation. Initially, law enforcement operated under a straightforward premise. According to statements given by Nolan's friends, they simply lost track of him around 3 p.m. near the north end of the island, where he was last seen talking to a young woman. When it came time to return to the mainland, the friends claimed Nolan voluntarily chose to remain behind on the island, suggesting he would find another ride home with someone else. On the surface, this explanation seems to resolve the primary question of how he became separated from his group. In a festive environment, plans change and people drift between crowds. However, that explanation only works if we ignore the physical evidence Nolan left behind. When the boat returned to the mainland without Nolan, it carried 2 items that belonged to him: his truck keys and his smartphone. This detail challenges the common assumption that Nolan made a conscious, casual decision to stay behind. The distinction matters because in the modern world, a smartphone is not merely an accessory, it is a lifeline, especially on a remote barrier island 10 miles from home. A highly driven, responsible college athlete who is actively preparing for a rigorous football season does not logically choose to strand himself on a desert island while leaving his only means of communication and the keys to his vehicle inside a boat that is sailing away. If we accept that Nolan would not willingly abandon his phone and transport, the narrative of a voluntary separation begins to fracture. The real issue becomes less about why he stayed and more about whether he was given a choice at all. If his presence on that beach after sunset was not voluntary, the entire timeline presented by those who were with him must be viewed through a completely different lens. Before we can answer what happened to Nolan Wells on that beach, we have to look closely at the narrative of how he got left there. And that's where the story becomes more complicated. But before we unpack the breakdown of that timeline, take a brief moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. In independent investigative journalism, those simple actions are the only way the algorithm pushes stories like Nolan's to a wider, national audience. By subscribing, you ensure you will receive the freshest updates on this case as they break, drawing directly from exclusively verified evidence rather than the rumor mill. The distinction between what is assumed and what is forensically proven matters now more than ever. When an investigation hinges entirely on the word of a few individuals, the structural integrity of their story becomes the most critical asset in the case. In the days immediately following the recovery of Nolan Wells's body, the official narrative seemed anchored to a single crucial assumption: that Nolan made a conscious decision to separate from his group. The three high school acquaintances who operated the boat maintained that Nolan simply chose to stay on Horn Island as they prepared to head back to the Mississippi mainland. What makes this claim significant is that it forms the foundation of their entire alibi. If Nolan chose to remain on that remote beach, their departure is a lapse in judgment, not a matter for a criminal investigation. For the first 48 hours, investigators largely accepted this premise, focusing their timeline around the window around 3 p.m., which was the last time Nolan was confirmed to have been talking to a young woman on the north side of the island. It was assumed that somewhere between that final sighting and the boat's departure, Nolan changed his plans, found another social circle, and essentially cut himself loose from his original ride. But that timeline has recently been thrown into sharp conflict. Prominent civil rights attorney Ben Crump, who was retained by the Wells family, came forward with new information that directly challenges this sequence of events. According to the family's legal team, an independent witness, a young woman Nolan was actively communicating with on the island, contradicts the friend's account. This witness alleges that Nolan explicitly stated his intention to return to the mainland on the exact same boat he arrived on. The distinction here matters immensely. We are no longer dealing with a vague assumption about an 18-year-old's spontaneous decision-making. We now have a documented statement of intent that completely opposes the narrative provided by the individuals who left him behind. If Nolan intended to board that boat, the assertion that he simply walked away and chose to strand himself 10 miles out at sea becomes structurally unsustainable. This direct contradiction forces us to ask a deeper question. If Nolan wanted to go home, why did the boat leave him behind? To understand why the family remains deeply skeptical of the voluntary separation theory, we have to look past the verbal statements and examine the physical objects that returned to the mainland. As noted, Nolan's truck keys and his smartphone did not stay on the island. They traveled back with the boat. Using the Life 360 location sharing app, Nolan's mother, Christine Wansley, was able to track her missing son's phone directly to the residence of one of the men on the boat. This discovery introduces a profound digital anomaly into the investigation. Anyone who knew Nolan described him as a highly social, expressive teenager who constantly documented his life. On a major holiday like the 4th of July, surrounded by crowds at a massive beach gathering, an 18-year-old student-athlete leaving absolutely zero digital footprint on his primary social media application is not just unusual, it is statistically improbable. The public initially assumed that perhaps Nolan's phone had simply died early in the day, or that he had been too distracted to use it. But a closer look at the device revealed that it wasn't just a lack of activity. The account was entirely cleared of any data associated with that day's excursion. The deeper implication of this missing data is difficult to avoid. Because the phone was in the physical possession of the boat's passengers from the time Nolan vanished until it was retrieved by his mother, the absence of these records suggests a deliberate act. It raises the distinct possibility that the device was systematically scrubbed of its photos, videos, and communication logs after Nolan disappeared, but before the hardware was returned to his family. In any modern forensic investigation, the intentional destruction or alteration of digital evidence is treated with the utmost seriousness. If data was removed, it implies that someone believed the contents of that phone, whether they were location tags, background audio, text messages, or images, posed a risk to the narrative being presented to law enforcement. It shifts the focus of the case from a passive failure to communicate to an active effort to control information. If the digital records were altered, we are no longer looking at a passive failure to communicate. In the vacuum left by a lack of immediate official answers, the public arena will inevitably attempt to construct its own reality. When an investigation spans a physical location as vast and heavily populated as a holiday beach day on Horn Island, the digital environment changes from a collection of private memories into a vast repository of potential evidence. Within days of the discovery of Nolan Wells' body, the digital footprint of the afternoon of July 4th shifted dramatically with the sudden emergence of a viral video clip circulating across social media platforms. The footage in question, captured by an unrelated holiday visitor, depicts a highly volatile physical and verbal altercation occurring directly near the Horn Island shoreline. What makes this development significant is that it injects an entirely new variable into what had previously been described as a peaceful, typical holiday outing. The audio in the background is fractured, but distinct segments reveal individuals arguing intensely over a cell phone. For an investigation trying to establish why an 18-year-old athlete was left behind on an island while his phone returned to the mainland, a recorded conflict centered around a mobile device provides a potential real-time window into tension that local authorities had not initially disclosed. Naturally, the public and online sleuths quickly jumped to a massive assumption. The prevailing belief across social media was that the grainy, distant figures in the video were definitively Nolan Wells and the group of acquaintances he arrived with. In the collective mind of the internet, the clip was treated as direct evidence of a physical confrontation, a definitive prelude to a crime. That interpretation may sound straightforward, but an analytical examination of the evidence requires a much higher threshold of verification. Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter noted that while investigators are actively tracking the origin of the video, its authenticity and its connection to Nolan remain entirely unverified. The individuals in the footage are obscured by distance, sun glare, and poor resolution. Independent investigators working alongside the Wells family have begun audio forensic analysis to determine if the voice heard demanding the phone matches Nolan's distinct vocal patterns, but currently it remains legally and forensically unconfirmed. What makes this situation even more complex is that the video was not the only piece of unverified digital noise to surface. Almost simultaneously, a secondary rumor began to spread across local networks, a geotagged photograph alleging to place a young man matching Nolan's exact description at an inland pool party on the Mississippi mainland early on the morning of July 5th, hours after his mother had already reported him missing. The implication of this second piece of media was clear. It suggested that Nolan may have successfully navigated his way off Horn Island with a completely separate group of people, rendering the timeline of the island disappearance entirely obsolete. This raises a critical question for investigators. If the photo was authentic, it would mean Nolan was alive on the mainland while search parties were just beginning to deploy to the barrier island. It would shift the focus of the inquiry entirely away from the shores of Horn Island and onto the individuals present at that mainland gathering. The real issue becomes the sheer polarization of these two digital breadcrumbs. Investigators found themselves caught between two diametrically opposed, entirely unverified narratives. On one hand, a viral video suggests an atmosphere of hostility and potential violence occurring right on the shoreline before the boat left. On the other hand, a digital rumor suggests a successful, undocumented return to the mainland. The distinction matters because both accounts cannot be true. If there was violence on the island, the voluntary stay narrative falls apart completely. But if he made it to the mainland, the entire physical search parameters were flawed from the start. What remains unresolved is how these digital fragments can be reconciled with the hard, undeniable physical reality of the case, that less than 48 hours after these alleged events, Nolan's body was pulled directly from the waters off the island's northwestern tip. It is worth examining why these digital anomalies carry so much weight. In an era where physical evidence can be difficult to parse in open water, the digital trail is often what breaks a case wide open. But when that trail is corrupted by unverified uploads, rampant speculation, and conflicting timelines, it can obscure the physical facts rather than clarify them. Before we chase rumors of an inland pool party, we must analyze the physical reality of where his body was eventually discovered, which leads to a more important question. When dealing with an unwitnessed death in open water, the physical condition of the body is often the only objective witness left. Following the recovery of Nolan Wells' remains off the northwestern tip of Horn Island, the Jackson County Coroner's Office released a preliminary assessment that seemed to offer a tragic yet straightforward explanation. The suspected cause of death was accidental drowning, with officials noting a distinct lack of external trauma that would immediately point to a violent assault. What makes this finding significant is that drowning is a recognized frequent hazard along the Mississippi Gulf Coast. The waters surrounding barrier islands are prone to sudden drop-offs, shifting sandbars, and unpredictable undercurrents. To a casual observer, the preliminary assessment provides a simple, tragic closure. A young man who, for reasons unknown, entered the water, became overwhelmed by the elements, and ultimately succumbed to the sea. The public assumption immediately solidified around this idea. The prevailing thought was that Nolan, left alone on the island as night approached, attempted to swim across a pass or simply waded too far out into the surf on the holiday afternoon and was swept away by a strong rip current, with his body washing ashore 2 days later on July 6th. However, that explanation only works if we overlook the distinct physical and geographical contradictions raised by maritime experts and Nolan's family. Nolan Wells was not a casual beachgoer unfamiliar with physical exertion. He was an elite 18-year-old college wide receiver at the absolute peak of his cardiovascular health and muscular strength. Furthermore, he was a capable swimmer. The assertion that an athlete of his caliber simply slipped beneath the surface of a heavily populated, shallow holiday beach area during peak daylight hours without a single person witnessing a struggle, noticing splashing, or hearing a cry for help runs contrary to the typical mechanics of an accidental drowning in a crowded environment. But the geographical timeline introduces an even deeper hydrostatic contradiction. On July 5th, the day after Nolan vanished and a full day before his body was officially found, Nolan's father, along with one of Nolan's football coaches, personally took a boat out to Horn Island to conduct their own desperate search. They focused their efforts intensely on the exact northwestern tip of the island, scanning the shallow shorelines and the precise coordinates where the body would eventually be discovered. They saw absolutely nothing. The distinction matters because of how human bodies behave in water. The public often assumes a drowning victim immediately floats or drifts vast distances. In reality, a body typically sinks initially, and the rate at which it resurfaces heavily depends on water temperature, depth, and body composition. For an incredibly lean, muscular athlete, the body has less natural buoyancy. If Nolan had drowned in that shallow area on July 4th at noon, his body likely would have remained near the site of the incident before rising, yet experienced eyes scanned that exact grid on July 5th and found the waters empty. It wasn't until July 6th that a U.S. Park Service ranger spotted the remains. This gap in the timeline raises a troubling question. Was Nolan's body actually in that water on July 5th when his father searched the area, or did it enter the water much later than the initial timeline suggests? If the body was not there on July 5th, the theory of a simple afternoon drowning on July 4th becomes difficult to sustain. It introduces the possibility that Nolan was either alive on another part of the island or that his body was deposited in that specific location after the initial search had already concluded. Faced with these physiological and geographic inconsistencies, the Wells family took a step that underscores their profound distrust of the local findings. Backed by civil rights leaders and funded through resources provided by former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick, the family bypassed local jurisdictional constraints and ordered an independent, comprehensive second autopsy. The remains were flown directly to Washington, D.C. to undergo a rigorous forensic examination by independent pathologists, specifically looking for deep tissue trauma, internal injuries, or toxicological markers that a standard external evaluation might miss. The mechanics of how he entered the water remain entirely unexplained. That explanation only works if the initial timeline provided to authorities was accurate. When an investigation moves past the initial window of discovery, its ultimate trajectory is often determined by the institutions that step in to govern it. In the 2 weeks following the recovery of Nolan Wells' body, the case transformed from a local maritime tragedy handled by a single county sheriff's department into an active, multi-jurisdictional inquiry drawing the highest levels of scrutiny. Under intense public pressure, the Jackson County District Attorney officially agreed to present the entire evidentiary file to a grand jury once the active police investigation concludes. What makes this development significant is that a grand jury presentation completely alters the legal landscape of the case. It means that the determination of whether a crime occurred will no longer rest solely behind the closed doors of local law enforcement. Instead, subpoena powers can be leveraged, witnesses can be compelled to testify under oath, and the timeline can be subjected to formal judicial review. Concurrently, the FBI's Jackson Field Office stepped into the periphery, providing technical assistance to trace the digital anomalies that have haunted this inquiry from day one. The public assumption immediately surrounding these updates was that an indictment or a definitive resolution was imminent. In the collective mind of a watching nation, the involvement of federal resources and the promise of a grand jury are treated as clear signs that a cover-up has been breached and that a hidden truth is about to be exposed. That expectation may sound intuitive, but the reality of institutional intervention is far more measured and complex. The primary public footprint of federal law enforcement up to this point has not been a hostile takeover of the homicide inquiry. Instead, federal resources have been heavily directed toward investigating interstate threats and severe online harassment targeted at the individuals who were on the boat with Nolan. The local sheriff's department maintains primary jurisdiction over the death investigation itself, and officials have repeatedly reiterated that cooperation from the surviving passengers remains intact. The introduction of these agencies hasn't accelerated the arrival of answers, rather it has formalized a long, grinding process of forensic verification. The deeper implication of this current phase is an investigative standstill. We are left watching a case caught between competing mechanics. On one side, local authorities are building a traditional open-water death investigation. On the other, independent civil rights experts and high-profile advocates are building a case centered on systemic failures and digital tampering. As the case stands today, the lens through which we view the tragedy of Nolan Wells has fundamentally shifted. What has been clarified is the baseline physical reality. Nolan Wells traveled to Horn Island on July 4th. His body was recovered 2 days later, and his primary belongings, his phone and his keys, returned to the mainland without him. What remains entirely unknown is the connective tissue between those facts. We do not know the true contents of the digital data allegedly scrubbed from his device. We do not have the verified identities of the individuals in the shoreline video, and we do not yet have the final reconciled results of the state's autopsy balanced against the independent forensic review flown to Washington, D.C. The story no longer looks like it did in the initial hours of July 5th, when it was characterized as a simple case of a teenager making a reckless, voluntary decision to stay behind on a beach day. It has evolved into a deeply scrutinized, highly polarized investigation involving missing digital footprints, explicit witness contradictions, and a family fiercely refusing to let the ocean claim the final word. The next major question investigators must answer is not whether Nolan Wells entered the water, but exactly what transpired in the final hours on that beach that left an elite athlete alone on an island while his lifeline sailed away without him. That is the threshold the grand jury will eventually have to cross.